A Chinese expert is warning Australia that other countries may target the nation for nuclear attacks, all because Australia signed a new security pact with its allies. China's neighbors are racing to purchase new weapons. They're bolstering their defenses to counter China's military expansion. The global stock markets respond to Chinese real estate giant Evergrande's potential collapse. How likely is it to happen, and how would it affect the global economy? We spoke with an economist to find out. And the U.S. plans to reopen air travel to foreign passengers, but only when they are fully vaccinated against COVID-19. That includes those from China, but are Chinese vaccines effective enough to qualify? Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Before today's news, we have a short announcement about our newsletter. If you're interested in a short weekly summary of what's really going on in China and some behind-the-scenes content of what we're up to, make sure you subscribe to our China in Focus newsletter. You can find the link to sign up in the description box down below. Every Friday morning, the latest will land in your inbox. And first, let's turn to nuclear tensions between Australia and China. A Chinese expert is warning Australia that it's become a nuclear war target, all because it signed a security pact with the U.S. and UK. The new pact gets Australia 8 nuclear submarines, and even though they won't be armed with nuclear weapons, China expert Victor Gao hints the deal could get Australia in big trouble. He says Australia will lose the privilege of not being targeted by other countries' nuclear weapons, something he said should be a wake-up call for Australians. And to Australia's 20-plus million population, he asked, do you really want to be a target in a possible nuclear war, or do you want to be free from the nuclear menace going forward? When asked about what nations would set nuclear sites on Australia, Gao replied, you do not need to know whom it will be. A national security expert says warnings like this could have an adverse effect.
For China to make comments about nuclear weapons and nuclear targeting of Australia, it's just going to have the same effect as its actions of the past decade, which is solidifying, I think on a bipartisan basis, both Labour and the Liberal Party in Australia, creating this momentum for not just a continuation of AUKUS, but potentially further strengthening that approach to foreign relations.
Gray pointed out that it was the Chinese regime's actions that pushed Australia to this point.
Australia 10 years ago was economically very much interdependent with China. There was an open question about which direction Australia would take as it related to the United States.
But a decade later,
we now have this extraordinary alliance. And what happened in the interim? China pushed Australia over into the position where they felt this was the best geostrategic option. China did it, if you look all this year, from PLA generals to senior CCP members to Chinese academics and news commentators, the Global Times, constantly harassing Australia, talking about how Australia would be easily defeated in a war, how the United States couldn't defend Australia. You look at the boycott of Australian wine.
Gray says Beijing is now seeing consequences for those actions.
I think the ultimate effect of it has been to force the Australian strategic community to make very hard choices about what is in their national interest.
He explains that Australia came to the decision that China's ambitions are not compatible with Australian national security, and that's what forced the country into the new alliance with the U.S. and UK. Now we look to the Indo-Pacific, where countries around China are also shoring up their defense capabilities, and the U.S. is helping some of them gear up. It's part of their reaction to Beijing's military expansion. First off, Australia. The country has been making headlines for forming a new alliance with the U.S. and UK to counter China. Under the new pact, both the U.S. and UK would share highly sensitive nuclear submarine technology with Australia. The move is an unusual one because the U.S. has only ever shared that technology with the UK, and that was to counter the Soviet Union. Under the new agreement, Australia is also set to gain 8 nuclear submarines that outshine conventional ones. They're faster, quieter, and more lethal. In comparison, the Chinese Navy reportedly has 6 nuclear submarines and plans to expand that fleet in the coming decade. Australia is also boosting its long-range strike ability with a new missile from the U.S. The U.S. Tomahawk cruise missile boasts a range of over 1,000 miles. What's more, the State Department has approved a deal to sell over 20 attack helicopters to Australia, worth over $3 billion. Up next is Taiwan. The island is planning to spend over $8 billion to beef up its weapons capability. That includes getting a hold of some new missiles. Last month, Washington approved a potential sale of 40 artillery systems to Taiwan, a deal valued at over $700 million if it goes through. It follows a similar sale last year when the U.S. sold about $5 billion worth of weapon systems to Taiwan. Now to South Korea. The nation successfully tested a ballistic missile launched from a submarine last week. It's also the first country without nuclear weapons to develop such a system. As for North Korea, it tested its first railway-based missile system to strike what it called threatening forces. And in Japan, officials have spent millions of dollars on long-range weapons. The country is also developing new anti-ship missiles. Those give Japan the ability to target warships that approach its Senkaku Islands from a greater distance. China and Japan both claim the Senkaku Islands as their territory. President Biden delivered his first address at the United Nations General Assembly in New York this morning. He declared that the United States is back at the table.
Tuesday in New York, President Biden addressed the 76th session of the United Nations General Assembly. Chinese leader Xi Jinping has said he will attend the general debate via video link.
I'm here.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres recently implored the two nations to repair what he called their completely dysfunctional relationship, saying a new Cold War could spill damage onto other parts of the world. In a Monday briefing, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki responded to his concerns.
Well, first I would say the president's view and this administration's view is that our relationship with China is one not of conflict, but of competition. And so we wouldn't agree with the characterization of the relationship.
She cited Biden's recent phone call with Xi Jinping. According to a White House statement, the two leaders discussed guardrails to ensure competition does not veer into conflict. Psaki said Biden would clarify the U.S. position in the UN speech. Guterres' worries are justified. Except for a protracted trade war, tensions between the U.S. and China persist over issues like human rights and sovereignty in the South China Sea. On top of that, China's unrestricted warfare against the United States is still going strong in terms of social media manipulation, cyberspace hacking, and blame shifting after the pandemic. Psaki added that Biden intends to discuss the areas of mutual agreement with Xi Jinping on the sidelines of the UN Assembly.
Over the weekend, some towns and villages were flooded in southwestern China. Residents say that local authorities released the water from a reservoir overnight without giving them any notice. The flood destroyed at least 100 houses.
Heavy rains hit some regions in northwest China's Shanxi province over the weekend. It led to more than 70 flood waves coursing through more than 40 rivers. The floodwater destroyed houses and roads. Power was cut off and traffic was interrupted in some regions of Zhenping County. Local resident Ms. Zhou told NTD floodwaters poured into her town early Sunday morning from 1 to 3 a.m. and that more than 100 houses were damaged.
The floodwater rose at night. It was terrible. Even in a safe area, my house was still flooded and collapsed. Some people had just evacuated before their houses collapsed. All the farms were destroyed. It was a terrible mess.
Local residents said the authorities hadn't issued any notice warning of the reservoir's discharge. It's common practice in China to discharge waters from reservoirs during flood season to protect the dams there. But the authorities are known to open the floodgates without warning in the middle of the night so that they can avoid paying compensation to residents.
The river burst 800 meters along the bank. Damaged roads are still under repair. The grocery market was flooded too.
Ms. Zhou also said shops in the vegetable market suffered heavy losses.
Some stall owners may lose hundreds of thousands, even millions of yuan. The rocks and stones from the mountains damaged the roads, and now forklifts are moving the rocks and stones away. All the signals have been cut off due to lack of electricity. It is still relatively difficult to rebuild public facilities and private property.
Local residents say the same situation occurred back at the end of August. Flood water was discharged from a nearby power station without prior notice. The water flooded into the county in the middle of the night.
Chinese investors are voicing concerns about real estate developer Evergrande's massive debt. This despite efforts from the group's chairman to lift confidence in the firm. Beijing still shows no signs it will rescue the firm or block potential domino effects from tumbling onto the global economy.
Shares of Chinese property developer Evergrande plunged by as much as 7% on Tuesday. That's after it tumbled 10% the previous day. It has two repayment deadlines looming ahead, one this Thursday. Investors fear the giant could default on its mountain of debt and spark a failure through China's property sector and everything exposed to it, first the banks, then the broader market. Evergrande has $305 billion in liabilities, equivalent to 2% of China's GDP. The pressure to sell was high in Asia. The Hang Seng Index was at its lowest point in 11 months in morning trade. Japan's Nikkei fell nearly 2%, returning from a Monday holiday. A S&P report on Monday said there was a slim chance of Beijing bailing out the firm. S&P Global Ratings believed Beijing would only be compelled to step in if there was a far-reaching contagion causing major developers to fail and posing systemic risks to the economy, and that Evergrande failing alone would unlikely result in such a scenario. Evergrande's chairman, Hui Ga-yan, tried to downplay its debt crunch, though. In a letter to staff on Tuesday, coinciding with China's Mid-Autumn Festival, he said the firm will walk out of its darkest moment and deliver property projects as pledged. Investors in Evergrande, however, remained on edge. The Chinese government has been largely quiet about Evergrande on the public holiday. There was no mention of the firm's troubles in major state media.
How likely is real estate giant Evergrande to collapse? And how will that potential collapse affect the global economy? We spoke with an economist to find out more.
Evergrande's chairman wants you to believe his company is going to be just fine, but many aren't so sure.
I think that it's inevitable that Evergrande ends up defaulting because the reality of the company is that it's incapable of fulfilling its financial commitments, not just the short-term ones, but also the long-term ones. Because if you look at its cash flow generation, since 2012, it's been extremely poor.
Economist Daniel Lakai said the company has basically been piling up debts and borrowing new debt to pay off old debt.
It's a very challenging situation. The company, on top of that, has a substantial problem of assets that are, for lack of a better word, worthless, because many of them have no demand, have not been fulfilling the level of promises that the company was giving.
And Evergrande isn't alone. Many other major developers in China are equally deep in debt and lack market demand. That's one reason the Chinese regime may not want to bail Evergrande out. It will set a bad example.
Because if one looks at the worst performer and it's bailed out, then it's almost a free-for-all to continue to misbehave, isn't it?
And even if the regime can bail out Evergrande, it may not have the money to save everyone. In fact, economists have for years been warning about the housing bubble in China. According to a study by a renowned business school in China, 1 in 5 of the country's houses are vacant, meaning there are 150 million homes with no one living in them, hence all the so-called ghost towns across the country. Lakai also adds that the collapse of companies like Evergrande won't just affect the housing sector.
The contagion effect into other areas like finance, like the banking system, is also quite likely because these are very indebted companies with in a sector that is not small. Sector in its entirety is about 25% of the GDP of China.
And so how will all this affect the global economy? While Western bond funds, which have ramped up purchases of Chinese corporate bonds in recent years, are already feeling it. The Wall Street Journal reported that funds managed by Ashmore Group, BlackRock, and Pacific Investment Management, among others, are seeing sharp drops. Lakai believes the impact on developed economies won't be very significant, other than banks that have been very exposed to emerging economies and to China. But there could be some damage done to the emerging market.
China has played a very significant role in the financing of very questionable projects all over Latin America and frontier economies in Africa. Therefore, many of these economies that have relied on Chinese lending for very, very doubtful projects are going to see a credit crunch.
And for those who firmly believe the Chinese regime will always swoop in to save the day, Lakai says,
if one buys into a market based on the principle that the government or the central bank is going to bail you out of malinvestment, then one deserves the losses.
Penny Zhou, NTD News.
The drama of Evergrande may also spill into China's political field. The disgruntled crowd of investors and homeowners are demanding money from the real estate company. This could present one of the Chinese regime's biggest fears, social instability. That's especially so ahead of an important meeting coming up in 2022, the once in 5 years Party Congress, where Communist leader Xi Jinping will try to secure an unprecedented third term for himself. Beijing's crackdown on borrowing is starving companies of cash. A prominent Chinese developer group is selling its property management unit to a competitor and tried raising funds from its two major shareholders. The developer, called Guangzhou R&F Properties, said on Monday it will receive $1 billion from its two biggest shareholders. In a separate statement, developer Country Garden said it had agreed to buy R&F's property management arm for as much as about $1.5 billion. The announcements came as China Evergrande Group, the country's most indebted developer, said it had started repaying creditors with properties instead of cash. Evergrande's messy collapse could reverberate through a sector that accounts for roughly a quarter of China's economy. R&F was downgraded earlier this month by Moody's credit ratings company and put on a negative credit outlook by Fitch Ratings on Monday. Its shares fell 7.3% to an almost 13-year low on Monday before it announced its new funding sources. R&F has about $1.8 billion in bonds due next year. As of the end of June, the company has a total debt of $51 billion. The U.S. plans to reopen air travel to foreign passengers who are fully vaccinated against COVID-19. This rolls back travel restrictions from last year to combat the CCP virus. Beginning in early November, most vaccinated passengers from China, India, Britain, and many other European countries will be allowed to enter. The U.S. was under pressure to ease restrictions, especially for UK travelers. Britain started allowing fully vaccinated U.S. travelers to enter the UK in August, but the U.S. didn't change its policy. There will be some exceptions. Children who aren't eligible to be vaccinated yet won't have to comply, and the new rules don't apply to travelers crossing land borders with Mexico and Canada. But the U.S. government didn't say if Chinese vaccines would be recognized. In China, residents usually only have access to Chinese vaccines. The U.S. imposed an entry ban, first on Chinese travelers in early 2020, and then expanded it to other countries. New virus cases are still popping up across China. In Jiangxi province, a patient who had previously been infected and recovered from the virus tested positive again on Sunday. According to the area's local CDC, the case was spotted during a routine round of testing at a local quarantine site. Another person who had traveled alongside the patient just days before the diagnosis is now under quarantine. The CDC's announcement confirms that some of the patient's close contacts are under observation. It also paints a detailed map of the patient's recent travel history, including railways, restaurants, supermarkets, dorms, and shopping centers the person had visited. Several similar cases have appeared across China in recent weeks, where a recovered patient is found to contract the disease a second time. Due to Beijing's tight control over information's flow in and out of China, we cannot independently verify the number of confirmed patients. Multiple cities reported positive cases, and widespread quarantines and lockdowns are underway. Even hospitals are temporarily closed.
Several cities in China's southeastern Fujian province are also in chaos due to the pandemic. According to the Epoch Times, residents say that many people there are locked in their homes, a detail largely minimized in the area's official situation report. Inside the province, the city of Xiamen is one of those suffering, and Tong'an district seems to have it worst. There are no positive cases locally, but residents aren't allowed to leave, and all nearby factories are also shut down. A hotel staff member from Tong'an explained many hotels there have been designated as quarantine sites.
It's pretty dangerous here. Basically, everyone can find a long list of test reports when they switch their phone on. Tests are taken every 2 days or daily.
She says her hotel is now organizing a third round of virus testing. A local resident described the process of lining up to get tested on Sunday.
Now it seems we have one case. Yes, we're lining up. Yes, we're separated. The population is large here.
Besides factories, other local businesses are also shuttered. Reports say at least 3 hospitals and 2 community clinics have been closed. Even hospitals specifically designed for virus patients has now closed its clinic, a move that triggered major concern among residents. In another city inside Fujian province, called Putian, another local hospital has also closed its doors. That's because of a positive case spotted among its staff. The district where the hospital is located was since put under lockdown. The Epoch Times reached out to the hospital for comment, but didn't receive a response.
French senators are expected to visit Taiwan this autumn. The Senate's France-Taiwan Friendship Group is set to spend a week on the island. The decision was made despite pressure from China's ambassador to France, Lu Saye. That's according to French media outlet La Latra on Monday. French Senator Alain Richard chairs the group. In March, the outlet reported that he received a harshly worded letter from Lu, condemning the organization's planned visit to Taiwan. Richard openly responded, saying they would keep their plans and that the purpose of their visit is to learn from Taiwan's pandemic control strategy. Richard said, "Our relationship with Taiwan does not require consent from Beijing." And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching and see you tomorrow.